There is evidence in humans that ketogenic diets, that is limitation of carbohydrates, leads to increased stress hormones, that is cortisol, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and glucagon. Now, the cortisol and epinephrine may attenuate long-term, but glucagon is always going to be elevated when you are low carb or limiting your carbohydrates, and glucagon is clearly a stress hormone in humans. There are multiple studies showing that adding carbohydrates to athletes or to humans that are not doing intense exercise improves all sorts of metrics, improves cortisol metrics, improves recovery from exercise, or improves thyroid hormones, this sort of essential thermostat that your body has that tells your body where the metabolic rate should be. And guess what? If you want to stay lean, if you want to be healthy and have energy and feel good and have libido, or if you want to lose weight, you want your body's metabolism to work well. You want your thyroid to be moving your body's thermostat to the highest level possible at all times. So consider some of these downsides of ketogenic diets. Here's a paper, a short-term ketogenic diet impairs markers of bone health. Markers of bone remodeling were impaired after short-term low-carb, high-fat diet. Changes in the thyroid hormonal status in patients receiving ketogenic diet due to intractable epilepsy. Here's another study showing that the thyroid hormones are negatively affected by ketogenic diets. This is done in children. This is done in patients receiving a ketogenic diet due to epilepsy. The conclusions, the ketogenic diet caused thyroid malfunction and L-thyroxine may be required. This is the first report documenting the effect of a ketogenic diet on thyroid function. Thyroid function should be monitored regularly in epileptic patients treated with a ketogenic diet. I would go so far as to say that anyone doing a ketogenic diet, even if that diet is working for you, should have regular checks of TSH, T4, T3, free T3, free T4, and reverse T3. I have very rarely seen optimal levels, especially of total T3 and free T3 in people doing long-term ketogenic diets, which I think is a real clear signal that our bodies thrive with carbohydrates and see carbohydrates as a signal of abundance. You want your thyroid to work well. We know that when your thyroid is not working optimally, there are increased rates of all sorts of things, especially cardiovascular disease. What about cortisol? Cortisol is very clearly a stress hormone that is absolutely induced when you limit carbohydrates in humans. There are studies like this one, dietary macronutrient content alters cortisol metabolism independently of body weight changes in obese men. As you can see in the conclusions, a low carbohydrate diet alters cortisol metabolism independently of weight loss. In obese men, this enhances cortisol regeneration by 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1 and reduces cortisol inactivation by A-ring reductases in liver. The authors of this study found that in obese men who were doing low carbohydrate diets, that is 4% carbohydrates, for 4 weeks, levels of cortisol were increased due to reduced inactivation and increased regeneration by an enzyme specifically known as 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1. The name of that enzyme isn't important. What is important is the idea that on low carbohydrate diets, more cortisol remains in your body, at least for 4-week trials like this one, because of increased regeneration and decreased deactivation of cortisol. That is not a good thing for humans long-term. Excess cortisol leads to all sorts of issues in humans. You do not want your cortisol levels to be higher. Obviously, there are some physiologic utilities to cortisol, specifically a cortisol awakening response first thing in the morning that helps wake you up, but consistently elevated cortisol levels due to stresses induced in the body by limitation of carbohydrates is probably not a good thing for many humans. Returning to the idea of thyroid, specifically, here's another study showing that in 6 healthy males with 11 days of 3 diets, all having the same amount of calories and differing amounts of carbohydrates, specifically 85, 44, and 2% carbohydrates. So in this study, there were healthy males who had 11 days of 3 different diets based on their carbohydrate levels, 85% as carbohydrates, 44% as carbohydrates, and 2% as carbohydrates. And what they found was that all of these diets were isocaloric, but in the lowest level of carbohydrates, what they found was in the men who had levels of carbohydrates at 2% in their diet, there was increased protein catabolism, that is increased breakdown of protein, and lowering of the hormone T3. So very clear in this study that low carbohydrate diets increased protein catabolism and lowered thyroid hormones like T3. It's also been noted repeatedly in exercise studies in men that giving carbohydrates improves free testosterone and decreases cortisol after intensive exercise training. Here's a study showing an example of that. And in those who are exercising or doing intense exercise of any kind, Carbohydrate clearly improves the attenuation of the immune system after those exercises, as you can see here in this study very clearly. The authors say consuming carbohydrate, but not glutamine or other amino acids during exercise attenuates the rise in stress hormones, meaning that the stress hormones went up less, such as cortisol, and appears to limit the degree of exercise-induced immunosuppression, at least for non-fatiguing bouts of exercise. So I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to ketogenic diets and exercise performance, there is a benefit to having carbohydrates. When it comes to ketogenic diets and thyroid hormone status, there's a benefit to having carbohydrates. When it comes to ketogenic diets and electrolyte levels, there's a benefit to having carbohydrates in your diet. And when it comes to ketogenic diets and sex hormones like testosterone or free testosterone index, there is a benefit to having carbohydrates in your diet.